Hello everyone. So in our last video, we did a few basic examples of HTML, and we said what the basic syntax of a tag looks like and what are attributes and how they play a role in the general look of our web page. We said HTML is content-based, so everything that we put in our web page right now is content and it is displayed by default. But what we want to do in this section is we want to add a little bit more stylization. We want to add some elements of design, some colors. We want to move things around. We want to make things a little bit bigger. We want to add some animation as well as a little bit of interaction as well. So in this section, we're going to be talking about cascading style sheets, CSS. So let's dive right into this. All right, if you take a look here, this is our result at the end of the last video. You can see that we wrote our HTML stuff, and this is how it displays. Now, this content is reflective of the HTML, and only the content is reflective of the HTML. So notice there's not much style going on here. In fact, this is what your web page looks like when there's no style applied. When we want to apply a style, probably the best way to do it is to link up a file. So in order to link a file, we will go to the head tag, and we'll provide a link, and the relation to your file is the style sheet. So you want to link up a style sheet, and you're going to provide a reference. Now, before we do that, I'm going to go into the static folder and create a folder called CSS. And inside the folder CSS, I'm going to create a new file called style.css. The name is really up to you. The location also is up to you. I created a new folder here just because it keeps me a little bit organized. So here we're going to say from the root of the application, I'm going to go into the CSS folder, and I'm going to go to style.css. So this is what links up our current HTML file into this style.css. And this is where I'm going to apply all of the style information for my web page. So you'll notice that we have our different elements here. And if you look closely, what we basically have is kind of a hierarchy of tags. So if you in particular take a look at the body tag, inside of the body tag, you'll notice that we have a header, right? So our header goes from here to here. We have a main, which goes from here all the way down to here. And then we have a footer. Now within the main, you can see that there's an H1. There's a section, there's another section, there's a form, and there's a table. So you can start to imagine that there's this tree hierarchy happening here. And this is the thing that we have to envision in our minds, right? So we have the body followed by the header. This is like the first child, the second child, and then from main, we have a first child and a second child, and so on. So in the back of our minds, this is how we envision any HTML file. And this document object, this model is going to be very important in CSS as well as in JavaScript, which we're going to take a look at in the next section. So how we apply a style is we go into style.css, and I want you to see that the CSS file is actually under our static folder. Okay, so being under the static folder, we will typically not have to restart the server. So notice that the server is actually running. We will not have to restart the server in order for the changes to take effect. So I'm just going to close up this terminal, and we're going to jump over to the style.css file, and we're just going to create some styles. Now, the way that we typically will apply a style is we first have to grab a particular element. And what that means is somewhere in this HTML file, I want to grab one or more of these elements, and I want to apply a style to them. So the easiest way to grab one of the elements is simply to name it. So for example, if I say header and I give it a style, so the header is going to have all the styles that I've listed inside of this open and close curly bracket. So if I want the same style to be applied to multiple elements, what I can do is I can provide a comma, and that says I have multiple elements that I want to grab in order to apply this style. So for example, if I wanted header, I wanted main as well as footer to have the same style. And this is typically not the way that I'd like to do it, but if for our example, let's pretend that this is what we're going to do. So for all of these, I want to apply the same style, which is I want to apply a border to it. Now you notice that when I type border, there's a lot of things that we can do with border. We can do a border radius, we can provide a border border bottom, a border color, a border width, a border style, and so on, right? So there's actually a shortcut where we have a border property, and by the way, the property and value are pairs, which are separated by a colon in CSS. So we say border, and I'm going to say the border is made up of a 1 pixel solid black border. So notice that we have actually 3 values that are separated by a space here. And so border is actually a shortcut for me to name the thickness, the type of border, and also the color of the border. Let's take a look at what this looks like first of all. So notice I'm actually applying to these three tags, and this is corresponding to header, to main, as well as to footer. So you'll see that the result is that I have a border that goes around those three things. I hope you can see that. So we have our main part, and then we have our footer part, which also has a border. Now, all three of these, notice that the border spans from the left-hand side to the right-hand side. So essentially, it spans the whole width of our web page. Now, this is true for certain items and certain elements, which we call block items. So for example, H1, if we apply the same style to H1, so I'm just going to go H1 here, and for H1, I'm going to actually make it a little bit more elaborate of a border. So I do 3 pixel, and then I'm going to do, let's say, dotted, and I want to have a green border. Okay, so you'll notice that for colors, there's actually a lot of named colors that are web safe. So there's a lot of these colors that you can look up in the CSS reference, and you can use any of those colors to, to make your web page look a little bit better. So if we take a look at what that looks like, you'll notice that now you see this is green, and it again spans all the way across the width of our web page. And you'll notice that H1 is also what we call a block level tag. It's not always the case, because there are some tags that are not block level. They are inline, or they are flow elements. So for flow elements, one example of this would be the A tag, would be the anchor tag. Okay, so if I take the anchor and I want to apply a border to my anchor, so I'm just going to say that these anchor tags are right there under my navigation. And if I apply the style to that, so let's do a background color. Okay, so we'll do a background color. Whoops, I don't want to do that. I want to do background color, and notice that the background color, you have a lot to choose from, right? So I'll choose cyan. These are, so notice the last 3 colors I've picked, they are actually named colors, right? So there are other ways that we can provide color names. I'll talk about that in 1 second. But if we take a look at the what A takes up, you'll notice the A tag does not take up the full width of the web page, and these are called inline or flow elements. And that simply means that they are in the flow of the CSS. Now, typically in a CSS element, or sorry, in an element, there is a box that we call a CSS box that describes every element. And so on the outside of this box, we have the margin. Okay, so the margin describes the space that I have up till the border. We have the border. Okay, so we have the border itself, and then between the border and the actual content, we call the padding. And then we have the content itself with the width and height of the element. So all of these things we can apply, and when we change these things, you can then see it get updated accordingly on the CSS. So as an example, if I go to H1 currently, we have the border around H1. Okay, and then we have, well, we actually don't have any margins here, although it kind of looks like we do. I'm going to apply a margin now. And when we do a margin, this will allow us to be able to add some space on either side, or on every side of this, this box. So margin, we can either provide one measurement. So if I do 50 pixels, I can show you that that now there's 50 pixels all around the H1 element, right? So on every side of the H1 element, there are 50 pixels. Or I can actually provide 4 values. Now, I'm going to show you that there's, if you remember my description, between the border and the content, there's typically a padding. Now, by default, there's actually no padding here, but I can also specify the padding of this element. Now, these things, the box, the CSS box that I've just described, this border, this margin, and this padding appear for all elements that you can grab. Okay, so not only can you grab the H1 element and apply these things, you can apply it to any element, and I encourage you to play around with that, and that's really the only way that we can learn. So let's add some padding here. So as we said before, we can actually provide 4 different values for it. So as an example, let's apply 20 pixels here. Right? And then followed by, well, the next one, you probably won't be able to see it. So we'll do 30 pixels, we'll do 40 pixels, and finally we'll do 50 pixels. Now, when we provide 4 values for a padding, typically what happens is we start at the top. We always go from the top, and then we go clockwise around this box. So that means the padding on top is going to be 20 pixels. The padding on the right side is going to be 30 pixels. So as I said, you probably won't be able to see that here. And then here will be 40 pixels, and then here will be 50 pixels. Okay, so this is generally how this is applied. So you can kind of see that that is the thing that's being applied, and you can see that there's a kind of a box going on here. All right, so anytime we want to get rid of some style, we can always comment it out. So for example, if I don't like the margin right now, I can comment that out, and that margin is now gone. It's only left with the default. So we have the header text with this border around it, right? So now that's the only thing that's left. So in the same way, we can pick any of these elements that we have defined as tags. But remember last time we said there are special ways that we can actually identify each one of these elements if they have the same tag. So for example, this section is differentiated by this section because one of the classes is called sec1 and the other class is called sec2. So in order to grab the element corresponding to a class, we can, instead of writing the element name, we can do a dot and then the class name. So sec1 dot sec1 is going to refer to a class called sec1. So here, let's pretend that we want a color, and this time I want to I don't want to have a color that that is predefined. Instead, I want to have a hexadecimal value for my color. Now, when we define a hexadecimal value for color, we typically use 2 hexadecimal digits at a time. So for example, if we do 11 FF55, this is going to be a shade of green because the first 2 is R and the second red. The second 2 is G, which is green, and then the third 2 is blue. Okay, so you can see that FF is the largest component here, and so you can see that this is going to give me some shade of green. Okay, so I'm just going to say that this is going to be the color, and just so we can see it a little bit better, for every section, I'm going to give it a little bit of a padding. So I'm going to give it padding, let's say 10 pixels, and I'm also going to have a, let's do a border. And again, 1 pixel. This time I'll do a dashed. What color do I want? Red. Okay, so 1 pixel dashed red. I'm not sure if we'll be able to see that very well on the result, but this is what it looks like. So you'll notice that the 2 sections, right, are both in red, right? We have a red border around it, but the sec1 is now colored in green. Okay, so the color corresponds to the text color. All right, so now, even though I applied a style to main, I can apply another style to main. So typically I organize my CSS files by going to larger elements down to smaller elements, although you can have different organizations if you'd like. For the main, I also want to apply this thing called font family. Okay, so font family is, you can see all the different choices that we have here. I'm going to pick, let's see, Arial, Helvetica, and sans serif. And what this font family are all of those fonts that do not have little tails after them. So I'm just going to show you what that looks like here. So once I apply this, you'll notice that everything that's in the main, right, everything that's in the main is updated so that the font is slightly different. So for example, here you see the R. I'm not sure if you can, you might want to zoom in a little bit here. So if there's this R, there's a little tail under the R. Whereas if you take a look at this R doesn't have a tail, right? So that's really the difference between a sans serif font, okay? And the Times New Roman is an example of a serif font. All right, now the other thing that I want you to notice is that when we applied this style to main, the font family actually gets inherited on all of these children, right? So all of these children got the inheritance of that font family. You'll notice that everything under main has now that Arial and Helvetica font. And now this is one thing about styles, because certain styles are inherited and other styles are not inherited. So for example, you'll notice that there's a border around main. However, the borders are not inherited. So for example, you see that like table, you see the table doesn't have a border, right? Because that border is not inherited to each one of the lower elements, to the children elements. Okay, if it did, it would actually look really weird. So sometimes certain styles, it's pretty obvious whether they're inherited or not. But again, a quick check of the CSS reference will tell you which styles get inherited and which styles do not. All right, so now back to here. So in the last part, we talked about how classes are grabbed. Now, in the same way, I can grab an ID. So there was an ID over here called main part, right? So I can grab the ID called main part by doing a pound sign or this hashtag, and this is going to grab the main part, which is essentially the main, right? So if I just copied all of this here, right? So this is going to be just as good as grabbing that main element. So if I apply that style to main part, right? This is only going to apply it to that, to the main. All right, so we take a look at, and of course you won't see any difference here because essentially we haven't touched anything. All right, so what we have next is we can now take a look at positioning. So let's see where we can, or how we can move certain elements around. Now, this is probably one of the more frustrating things that we're going to have to do throughout our CSS lives. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab H1 and very quickly give it a width as well. So here I'm just going to give it a width, and let's say the width is, I'm going to apply the width to be 30%. Okay, so 30% is 30% of, you can probably see 30% of the parent, right? Actually, 30% doesn't look good to me. So maybe we'll do 50% and see if that looks a little bit better. Okay, so we have 50% of how the parent is to be displayed. Okay, so right now we've shrunk the width a little bit. We now have the padding to be, however we set it up. So we're pretty happy with this. So let's say that I want to I want to do a positioning. Okay, so I want to position this H1 into different locations. So I'll give you an example of two types of positions. So if we do a position, there is one value called relative. All right, so if we do a relative position, now anytime we apply a relative or any type of position, there are attributes that go along with it. There's the top, bottom, left, and right attributes that we can apply. So for example, if we do a top and we'll do 100 pixels, and then we'll do a left, and also we'll do 50 pixels for left. Okay, and if we take a look at the outcome here, I want you to see that currently H1 is right here, and the result, if we add a position to it, is that we've moved the header text down 100 and over 50. Now, essentially, the way to think about this is I've added 100 pixels to the top, and I've added 50 pixels to the left. Okay, so that's really the way to think about relative positioning. So it's still there. So imagine that the element is still there. All I've done is just added 150 to the to this element. Okay, now relative means it's relative to the position that it's supposed to be in. Okay, that it's supposed to be in. All right, let's take a look at another example. So right now I'm just gonna comment this out first and bring this text back to where it was before. And I'm going to now use another type of position, which is called an absolute position. Now, in an absolute position, this one's a little bit harder to understand, but essentially what happens is we think of this as being removed. So think of it as I'm just going to physically remove the H1 from the flow, from the normal flow, so that it no longer exists. Okay, then I'm going to go to the parent, which in this case is the main, and then I'm going to apply the top and left and bottom and right attributes to it. Okay, so I'm gonna actually bring this back, but you'll see that when I apply absolute, that is exactly what's happening. Okay, so you can see that here. So I hope you can see what happened. It's as if I took the H1 element away, right? So right now the main only holds those things, the section 1, the section 2, as well as our form and our table, right? The header text is now with respect to our main 150, right? Same as before, but now there's 150, but it's corresponding to the parent, right? So this is corresponding to the top left corner of the parent, and that's how it's being moved. All right, so basically that is what positioning is. So position always goes with the top, left, right, or bottom attributes just to be able to move these things around. So if we go back to relative for 1 second, because relative is a little bit easier to see. So relative looks like this. If instead I did a negative 100 on the top, you can probably guess where this is going. This is going to move 100 up, right? So we're adding negative 100 pixels of space between where it was supposed to be. All right, so I hope all of that is clear. Now, that being said, position is probably not what I would typically recommend if you want to move elements around. Okay, so for H1, I'll leave it as is right now so that you can play around with those numbers. But moving an element using position is typically not recommended, just because the way that the browser is going to render this is essentially either taking the object away from its flow, or it pretends it's still there and it just puts another layer on top, like as in this case, right? So it could become a little bit more confusing, especially if we're not used to using position or not used to thinking in terms of layers, right? So just keep that in mind, and those are things that we will run into. Now, one last thing that I want to mention is that when we use positions, think of this as a layer, right? So we have a layer that's sitting on top here. So there are times where we might find it helpful to kind of move this layer back and forth, like deeper into the screen or further out from the screen. And that's what we use a Z index for. So a Z index for a particular element, if we push it at 0 in the negative direction, so if we do -1, this is kind of like pushing the H1 element into the screen. And if we do a +1, it's like pulling the element away from the screen, right? So if you ever find that you have certain elements that are kind of on top of each other, we can use these Z indexes just to move things forward and back so that we can group them in the right way. So this is very much like if you imagine Microsoft Word, we are bringing an element to the front, or we're pushing an element towards the back, right? So the Z index allows us to be able to do that. All right, now all of that said, if you're really wanting to move elements around, I highly recommend that you use instead a float. Okay, so what a float looks like is, if you take a look at the text for section 1 and section 2, if I grab section 1 again, so actually I've already grabbed section 1. So if in section 1, I have the color of green, but then I also do a float left. Okay, I want you to see what happens. Basically what we're doing is grabbing this section, right, and pulling it out, and then having everything else kind of treat it as if it's floating in the air. So it's trying to avoid this section 1 by kind of squirming around this section. So you can see that what happens is section 2, the text for section 2 actually tries to avoid it by moving to the right, right? So you'll notice that section 2 should be down here, but because this thing is floated, it's going to kind of move itself to the right side, and it's going to keep going. Now, if I add a little bit more text to section 2, so if I do section 2, let's add some BR tags. I'll say more text for section 2, and then I'll do another BR tag, and then more text. Okay, should probably spell more correctly. And if we do that, then you'll see that it kind of goes around, and it will kind of avoid this text for section 1. Okay, so I hope you can see what float is doing. Right? Now, on the other hand, if there's a float and we have another element, so for example, if I want to float section 2 as well, you can probably imagine what this is going to do. So if I instead add this to section 2 as well, right? So if I add section 2 to this style, you'll see that section 2 would also be floated to the left. So let's take a look at what happens there. You'll notice that the next element down is actually the form. So just to take a look at what this looks like, you'll see that section 2 is now floated, and now the form is trying to avoid section 1 and section 2. Now let's pretend that in our form, we say, oh, actually, I don't want the form to be here. I actually want the form to be pushed down, but I do want section 1 and section 2 to be floated in this way. So what we can do in that case is we can use we will grab the form, the whole form, and there is this property called clear, and we're going to clear the left side. And what that means is if there's anything floated to the left side of the form, I want to clear that, and I want to go to the next line. Okay, so clearing just simply means go to the next line. And so now you can see that the form is pushed down to the next line. So ultimately you can see that with the floating, I can float as many elements next to each other as I want, and then if we run out of room, we're going to jump to the next line. Or we can force it to the next line by doing a clear. Okay, so I hope all of that makes sense. And now the final thing I want to note here is just how to style the table. And we'll do one last example here just with the table. And here we can do table. And I want you to notice that in a table that there is the table row as well as the table datas, as well as the table headers. So I'm going to do the table headers, table, as well as the table headers, as well as the table datas. So notice here that there's no border around the tables. So if we apply a border, So 1 pixel, and then again, we'll do solid black. For the table, you'll see that what happens is that there's now a border for the table, but if you look closely, every one of these datas also has a border around it. Now by default, there's a little bit of a gap here. So notice that there's a little bit of a gap between each one of the cells of the table, right? So if you don't want that, and again, I'll let you kind of play around with all of these things. We can label specific table datas and have specific a CSS, right, applied to a certain table datas. Right, but for now, if we don't like this look, we can also collapse this by doing a collapse, border collapse, collapse. So if we do this, so I want you to see what the result is for that table. So you see that all of that gets collapsed, meaning that there is no longer any room between all of the cells. So ultimately, I don't have time here to show you every single feature, but there are different ways that we can grab elements in CSS, right? So we can grab elements using siblings, right? So using how the hierarchy looks like, right? So for example, I can have a sibling of H1, right? So I can say any section that's a sibling of H1, I want to apply a style, right? So for example, how to do that would be that I take the H1 and then I say any sibling that is a section, I want to apply a particular style to it. Right, and there's ways to do adjacent sibling as well. So I highly recommend that you take a look at the references for CSS. CSS itself is a really big language, and it's probably one of my weaker languages, just because there's just so much you can do, and there's so many ways that you can do it. So the only way to really learn CSS is to play around with it and see what the result is, and so on. Right, so so just like any other language, but this one is actually pretty. It gives you pretty good feedback anytime we have something like that. All right, so one more thing that I want to do is I want to write a new file here. So in the static folder, I'm going to create another file called boots.html. All right, so now in boots.html, I want to show you something called Bootstrap. Okay, so this I would recommend using only after you're very comfortable with CSS, right? But because it's only after we learn CSS that this thing will make more sense, right? So what Bootstrap actually is, it's a library that somebody has written that has a lot of classes that has predefined styles associated to it, right? So instead of writing our own styles, I'm relying on somebody else's design, but the somebody else, that design is actually pretty elaborate, and it's pretty good, and it's pretty standard in a lot of websites nowadays. So the way that we're going to use Bootstrap is, let me just actually copy over some code that I have predefined. So I'm just going to copy this over. You'll notice that this is the structure of an HTML5 document. Okay, and the first thing we're going to do is, if we look down here, this figure tag is one thing that I didn't talk about in when we talked about HTML. But if we have an image called image.jpg, and instead of this, I actually want to put it into a folder called image. And so I'm just going to create that right now. So under static, I'm going to create a new folder called img. And inside this img, I'm going to place an image.jpg picture, right? And that is going to be the image that I'm going to display here. So inside of this figure, I have an image, which is going to have this baby, and there's going to be a title called smiling baby. And there's going to be a caption that says baby drawing. Okay, so what that looks like, if we now come back to our server, and remember this was hello.html, and our server is still running, so I'm going to jump over to boots.html. I'm going to take a look at what that looks like. So I have some default text here. In particular, I just want to show you the layout. I have the header and the logo and the nav, right? So very much like what we had before. I have the main content as H1, and then I have this div tag, this division tag, which I'm going to label in a second. But inside that division tag, I have two paragraphs. So those two paragraphs are inside the division tag. And I also have another div with an aside that's down here. Okay, and then after that, we have the figure, which has the baby, right, and the baby drawing. And if we hover over the baby, we'll see that we have a smiling baby, right? So that is the title. We also, if we scroll down a little bit, we'll have the table with the table headers, as well as some table data. And then down below that, we have a HR, a horizontal rule, as well as a form that is action to process. Now in here, you'll notice that I've added a few other a few more inputs. So these inputs are labeled as first name, which is a text, and then I also have a type color, right? Which if you take a look here, it gives you a nice color picker, right? When you pick a color picker, it actually gives you the value of R, G, and B. So that is by default what it gives you, and that is the value that you'll be getting with type color. Now, similarly, there is this data list as well. So this data list is a pull down menu. You can see that those are the options that I have. The pull down menu, the data list. One good thing is that it allows us free entering text as well. So if I want to freehand some text here, right, then I can type that in as well, and then I can hit submit, and this is going to be the value that is sent along. And notice that once again, we have this input type submit, that when we click this, all of this information will be sent to a process. And I'll talk about that in a later video. All right, so we have this layout of this HTML. And once again, we have some hierarchy that this defines. But what I want to show you in this part is if we go do a quick search on Bootstrap, if we go to Bootstrap 5, you'll see that on the main page, if we scroll down a little bit, there's a link to a CDN. Now, what a CDN is Content Delivery Network. Basically, this is the CSS that somebody else has written. So if we just copy this and paste it into our head tag, right, this is going to give me a link to the CSS that that person or whoever that wrote this library has given us. And this CSS includes a lot of different classes that are predefined that we can use for the purposes of making this look a lot better. Okay, now just by adding this, notice that when we go back to our document and I do a refresh, notice that just by adding this, I've actually, okay, so I didn't save it. If I do a refresh here, notice that the content has actually changed. The design has actually changed. You'll notice that the font is different. Some of the spaces are a little bit different, right? And so you can see that, some of the fonts are a little bit bigger. Definitely we have a different font family, right? And just by doing this, we've actually improved the look of our page. But in particular, we can add a few more things to this. So in a header, we can add, certain classes. In the main, we can add certain classes and so on. So I'm going to start with the main. And again, I would highly advise you to go through the Bootstrap tutorial and take a look at all the things that can be applied on Bootstrap. But the first thing I'm going to do with this main is I'm going to provide a class, and the class is going to be called container. Now, this is a key word, right? A container is telling Bootstrap that this main part is going to act as a container. And what they mean by container is that we can imagine our main container as having rows and columns. Now, in particular, I've labeled this div as a row type. Okay, so this class is going to be labeled as a row. So now now Bootstrap is going to say, okay, this stuff right here, right? So this div, right? This division tag is defined as a row, and now each of these paragraphs I can now define as columns. So I'm going to apply class, and then it's column, and I'm going to call it a medium column. And first I'm going to make this 4. And I'm going to do another one here, which I'm going to do class is equal to, and then column medium. And here I'm going to do 8. All right. Now, the number of columns that we can have other paragraphs as well, and we can label those columns as well. The numbers that are defined here are how many segments of columns that we want. So you can imagine that in this main container, we have 12 vertical lines going down. Okay, so imagine 12 vertical lines going down. So what 4 means is I want to take up 4 of these vertical lines. Okay, and 8 means I want to take up 8 of these vertical lines, and altogether they add up to 12. And so these numbers always should add up to 12. Okay, so you'll notice that when I do a refresh here, after I save it, so when I refresh the page, you'll see that the main content actually changed a little bit. We actually have a little bit of margin here, and our main content actually is displayed like this. Now this is telling me that this width is actually a little bit too small to be displayed as medium. Okay, so medium, small, or large is just basically the threshold where we pop back into the default. Okay, so this is the default, but if we size it up a little bit, you'll notice that as I size up, you'll see that the content actually gets separated into columns, right? And as we size down, you'll see that this goes back to the default. So what this means is when our browser is at a wide enough angle, we're going to display 4 columns. You can imagine 4 little columns here, and then there's 8 little columns over here for a total of 12 columns altogether. Okay. Now, let's say I don't like this. I actually want my content to be equal. So I can change these numbers to 6 and 6. So as long as they add up to 12, right, this will automatically resize it for me. Whoops. This will automatically resize it for me. So you can see now we have equal sizes for each of the columns. And once again, when we resize it, at some point, there's going to be a threshold that is hit where it pops back into the default. Now, you might be saying, well, what's that threshold? Well, those are predefined values. If you take a look at the Bootstrap tutorial or Bootstrap reference, you'll actually see where those thresholds are for medium, as well as for small, as well as for large. Okay, so the only difference between small and medium and large is really where is the threshold that this goes back to the default. Okay, so also notice that when we size this up, these two are columns, but the aside, notice it's in another div, right? So we can actually call this class equals row as well, right? Just to be organized. You can imagine that this is another row, and we could have several columns here as well, right? So I can even put the figure as one of the columns. So you can play around with that, right? But the idea is that, you know, we can specify, we can use these special classes that are predefined in the Bootstrap CSS. All right, let me show you just one more thing. If we go down to the table here, actually two more things. If we go down to the table here, we can have a table, right? So, oops, I'm sorry, table, class called table. So if we do a class called table and we save it, there is a table. There's one specific, or there's specific predefined tables. One of them is called a table dash striped. I hope this is how you spell it. Now, if you, again, take a look at the Bootstrap reference, you'll see all of the different types of tables out there. But right now, I want you to see how this changes. So this is the default of the table. If we label it as a class table and also table striped, this is going to give me this type of table. Right, so already we've improved the look of the table, but again, there's a lot of fine tuning that we can do with the classes that are defined in Bootstrap. Highly recommend that you take a look at some of them. There's also another one, just while we're here, there's also one called table dark, right? So if we fine grain that and call this table dark, it's going to give me kind of a darker shade of table. I actually don't like this, so I'm gonna get rid of this. But just so you know that there are different classes that we can define to to kind of change the look of every type of element that we can apply in our HTML. The last thing here is the form. So when we look at a form, typically we can apply some classes as well, some Bootstrap classes as well. So for example, I can provide a class here. So let's say this input, I'm going to add a class attribute, and this class attribute, let's say we're going to label it as form control. And again, I want you to see what the difference is, right? So here you can see that the form control CSS, the style actually changes it into something a little bit bigger, which probably looks a little bit better, right? So again, you can play around with some of those. For the submit button, again, there's a class. There's this class called button. So I'm going to make it button. I have one called a button primary as well. Okay, so again, take a look at the reference. There's a lot of different things that we can, a lot of different styles we can apply to it. So notice that it also gives us kind of a hover style as well for this button primary. Probably the best way, again, to learn how to use Bootstrap is to play around with it, take a look at what kind of styles they have in there, what kind of classes they have in particular, look at the reference, play around with some of the classes in the Bootstrap reference, and definitely this is going to shorten our work for stylizing a page and making a page look good, and also making a page look responsive or act responsive. Okay, so I'll let you play around with that. This is, again, kind of a crash course into CSS. There's actually many things that I can talk about in CSS. But for now, I think I'll leave it there. And in our next tutorial, what we'll do is take a look at the third aspect of the front-end development, which is JavaScript, which aside from the content and aside from the design, the look of your web page, we want to have some interactive elements to it as well. So when we come back, we're going to take a look at JavaScript. So I'll see you in the next video.